Every parent knows this situation that I'm about to describe. You have something special, something expensive, something precious, an antique watch, maybe some fine perfume, or some rarely used dinnerware that you only take out for special guests. One day you come home from work to find in horror that your child has discovered where it is and proceeded to spoil it or to break it. The watch face is cracked. The perfume has been sprayed liberally on curtains and pillowcases. The dinnerware set for 8 is now only fit for 7.5 because one of the plates is shattered to pieces. Now this happened to my mom one day. She had some precious crystal flutes with dabbers that she used for perfumes. One day, while she was out, I ransacked her makeup cupboard and proceeded to break one of those precious flutes. When she came home, she was understandably angry. She proceeded to make her sobering judgment. I was sentenced to 1 stroke of the cane to the palm. To be honest, the punishment hardly fit the crime, though you wouldn't have known it at that time from the way I wailed and sobbed at that horrible judgment. This week you will be reading from Daniel chapter 5 in your CBE readings. In it, God reveals himself as judge to Belshazzar, an insolent, blasphemous king. He scorns God's instructive acts in history and defiles his sacred vessels. After inscribing the judgment on the wall for all to see, God's divine hand sends the upstart king to his death and transfers one world empire to another, all in accordance with his divine plan. When Belshazzar hosted a banquet for 1,000 prestigious guests, he made a show of drinking from the goblets of Yahweh's temple, brought to Babylon decades earlier by Nebuchadnezzar. And in the middle of this blasphemous display, a disembodied hand appeared, writing on the palace wall. The king's terror rendered him incontinent, and when his wise men proved incompetent to interpret the writing, the queen advised Belshazzar to summon Daniel. After lecturing the king about his insolence and pride, Daniel told him that God's judgment was upon him and his kingdom, which then fell to the Medes and the Persians. A former bishop of the United Methodist Church said that one reason we love Bible stories like this from the book of Daniel is because we see creeps getting what they deserve. That is sometimes a rare occurrence in life, but a virtually everyday one in the Bible. In real life, creeps are rarely visible or visibly, swiftly punished. Creeps get elected to public office. They become presidents of large corporations or pastors even of large churches. But in the Bible, creeps get incinerated by fiery furnaces. They get eaten by lions. They get drowned in floods. They get their heads cut off or worse. And let's not lie to ourselves. We love that. That's why online vigilantism exists. That's why the world of citizen journalism is mostly a dark world of voyeuristic celebration over the downfall of people we think are creeps. An inconsiderate parked car, someone who refuses to wear a mask, a rude road cyclist, a graduate of Hwa Chong. There is a palpable glee when their identities are splashed for the world to see. Everyone longs for a world in which there is justice, even if the workings of justice are sometimes gruesome. Maybe particularly if the workings of justice are gruesome. Justice, after all, seems so rare in real life, but not in the Bible. And so we love it when the Bible takes one sleazy person, lets him strut about for about an hour upon the stage, and then zap. There's a fire, a flood, a lion, and then he's gone from history. It's delicious to see bad guys get what they deserve. But now some of us might be feeling uneasy. After all, we also live in a world where we are constantly told that everyone has the right to do as they please. Everyone has the right to free expression. The church is constantly berated for our stance, for example, on marriage. Who are you, we are told, to judge if two people love each other? love is love. In this context, judgment appears to be negative. The church, so the cultured despisers say, just throws around the words like God's judgment lightly. That last line is really the crux of the issue. No one today really wants to hear about God's judgment unless it's for people we don't like. No one wants to walk into the church and hear the preacher shaking a finger at them. That preacher would be very unpopular for being judgmental. No one wants to hear about judgment because judgment is uncomfortable, whether it's a judgment about us or a judgment about others. Judgment implies a pronouncement of opinion about a person or persons. And whether the judgment comes from our own mouths or is pronounced by another, it is often hurtful. Judgment is the kind of word that conjures up childhood memories of a parent's admonishing words. If you have nothing nice to say, don't say it. At the risk of rushing in foolishly where angels fear to tread, I believe that God has a word for us regarding judgment this morning. Let's look at the passage. The story begins with a new king of Babylon, Belshazzar. Belshazzar is hosting a party for 1,000 guests, the noblemen of Babylon, together with their entourage of wives and concubines. Suddenly, God crashes his party. Belshazzar, referred to throughout this chapter as Nebuchadnezzar's son, was neither the biological son of the great Babylonian king, nor even technically deserving of the title king. His actual father, Nabonidus, was the last reigning king of Babylon. Babylonian historical records show that Nabonidus spent significant time at a North Arabian oasis called Taima. While King Nabonidus was away from Babylon, however, his oldest son Belshazzar served in his stead. Although the records never assigned Belshazzar the royal title, he was as good as king when Nabonidus was away. And that is why we read in Daniel 5 that Belshazzar rewards Daniel by saying, "You will be the third highest ruler in the land." That's because Belshazzar, for all his display of opulent luxury, is actually only the second highest ruler in the land. So here we have a pretend king throwing a huge party. Then suddenly God brings judgment. Is God a party pooper? Does God hate parties? Daniel 5 tells us that Belshazzar sent for the goblets that Nebuchadnezzar plundered from Jerusalem. They were not just any goblets, however. Daniel 5:3 explains that they were the golden vessels taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. These were sacred vessels of Yahweh. So why did God judge Belshazzar for using his cups? Is God simply the deified form of my mother, judging Belshazzar for using his precious stuff while he was away? Daniel 5:30 tells us that very night Belshazzar paid for his foolishness with his life. The Babylonian Empire was over just like that, and the Persian Empire began. Now, I'm not sure whether you've heard of this, but there is a philosophy that prizes overreaction. The theory goes that when someone does something negative towards you, if you react proportionately, they will keep doing it until they figure out where your red line is. So, for example, if someone in class keeps insulting your looks, your body, your intelligence, and you respond with mild annoyance, they will keep doing it to you. Then maybe that someone turns their insults and insults your parents, for example, and then you lash out with rage and wrath. That person will now know that they can always bully you up to the point of insulting your parents, and so they will keep taking advantage of you. This philosophy says that the way to counter that is to wildly overreact to things. The next time someone commits a minor infraction against you, for example, bumps against you in the bus, overreact wildly. That will keep them on their toes due to them being unsure where your red lines to cross are. Is that what God was doing with Belshazzar? Imagine a party of an ancient king with 1,000 guests, drinking, eating, celebrating. It doesn't take much to imagine that the party would be full of acts considered sinful in the Bible: gluttony, greed, drunkenness, sexual fornication. Not to mention that this was a foreign king with power over all the exiles. Amidst all of that, was God's red lion really a set of precious golden vessels? All that fuss over some goblets? This judgment, at face value, appears random, arbitrary, and reactionary. Thankfully, Daniel 5 doesn't teach us that God is arbitrary, random, or reactionary. Belshazzar is simply a man who should have known better. He had no excuse. Daniel 5:11 repeats 3 times the connection between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers. Belshazzar knew who Nebuchadnezzar was and did not learn the lessons of what happened to him in Daniel 4. When Daniel is summoned before Belshazzar, he makes it clear to the king that he had failed to learn the lessons that his predecessor had won for him. This is what verses 18 to 23 spell out. Daniel recounts what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he set himself up against God. And in verse 22 delivers this damning indictment. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. In other words, you knew, Belshazzar, and still you disobeyed. You see, my friends, this is not just another moralistic lesson about the dangers of pride or drunkenness. When the great king Nebuchadnezzar transferred the vessels to the temple of his God, he honored his God by giving Yahweh's sacred vessels to his Babylonian God. No king, however great, had any right to use what properly belonged to the gods. But the brash Belshazzar commanded these sacred vessels for his own non-sacred use, which was an outrage even by the pagan standards of Babylon. The narrator of Daniel does not reveal why this idea came to the mind of Belshazzar or what he thought he'd accomplish by carrying it out. But it was not a random act, even for someone who was drunk. No matter how mentally impaired his judgment, a Babylonian king would never have considered such flagrant sacrilege. He did not run out of clean everyday cups and then called for the spare ones. Belshazzar had a particular propaganda purpose in mind. Maybe he thought that by drinking from the vessels, he could outdo his famous predecessor, who won the right to them in battle. Perhaps he wanted to shame Yahweh, whom he considered to be nothing more than the minor god of disgraced exiles. After all, the vessels were in the possession of a Babylonian god. The defeat of Israel's God was ancient history by Belshazzar's time. But we have already noted that Daniel 5 twice identifies the vessels as those taken from the temple in Jerusalem. Belshazzar put himself at the mercy of Yahweh, the defeated God of the exiles, years earlier, who apparently still retained possession of his sacred objects. Now, it might be difficult for us to truly appreciate the significance of the vessels to Daniel's audience. The author of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, for example, tracks the vessels' whereabouts during Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of the temple, making it clear that many of these vessels survived the horror of the destruction of Jerusalem intact. These vessels were, to the exiles, almost more important than anything else, more important than the monarchy, more important than the officials, the other captives, and treasures of Jerusalem. As the only tangible remains of Israel's life with God before the exile, the vessels lay at the center of the hope for restoration. While Nebuchadnezzar dismantled Jerusalem, false prophets fanned the people's hope by declaring that God would return the vessels to the temple within 2 years. The prophet Jeremiah had refuted these assurances. He told the people that the vessels would stay in Babylon and the remaining valuables would be taken as well. But Jeremiah also gave them hope. He said that the vessels would remain safely in Babylon until Yahweh returned them to their rightful place. Bound up in these sacred vessels was the promise that God would remember his people. The meticulous accounting for the vessels in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles highlights their significance to the people of God in exile. But Belshazzar could not have cared less about God's people or God's vessels. In Daniel 4, we learn that Nebuchadnezzar was a cruel and arrogant king who humbled himself before God. Now in Daniel 5, we see Belshazzar, a cruel and arrogant king who put himself in direct opposition to God by profaning the sacred vessels precious to him. Notice how he talks to Daniel too, in Daniel 5:13. You are dead, Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4, who at least speaks tenderly to Daniel, Belshazzar was rude and arrogant to God's spokesperson. In the end, Belshazzar's utter failure to learn the lessons of his predecessor, coupled with his cruelty, arrogance, and foolishness, brought about God's swift judgment. Where does this leave you and I today as we seek to understand this message of God's judgment? During the Old Testament times, God gave Israel clear instructions for how to treat things that were common and things that were sacred. The difference between the two was simple. Sacred things were set apart for God. For example, in theory, a bowl used in the tabernacle and a bowl used in the household kitchen could look exactly alike. But the former was sacred, while the latter was for common use. The boundaries between the two were demarcated by the curtains in the tabernacle. When Jesus hung on the cross, the curtain separating the holiest place from the rest of the temple tore open from top to bottom, signifying the end of that division between the sacred and the secular. It is easy to assume that nothing was sacred anymore. Jesus, after all, did away with all those rituals, didn't he? But the opposite is actually true. Nothing is secular anymore. There is nothing that is common, if by common and secular we mean an autonomous sphere of freedom apart from God. Everything is God's. Everything belongs to him. And all that belongs to him is sacred. Every person, every part of creation, everything. Christ's redemptive act reclaims the whole world, the whole cosmos for God. How do we treat the environment? It is God's. How do we care for our neighbors? They are God's. How do we engage fellow believers? They belong to God. The earth is indeed the Lord's and everything in it. We live and occupy and breathe in sacred space. There is plenty of injustice in the world to be concerned about, from pharmaceutical companies' price manipulation of life-saving medicine, to CEOs' obscene wealth, to the hoarding of COVID-19 vaccines from the poorest nations. Why has the gap between the rich and poor become so huge? Why are so many special needs and persons with disabilities slipping through the cracks? Why does violence against children and women continue to be prevalent? Why is the treatment of migrant workers continue to be so abhorrent? Why are the oceans suffocating with plastic and the forests perpetually on fire? Where's the outrage? The public is outraged all over cyberspace about all kinds of things that annoy us personally. The NIMBY, not in my backyard, NIMBY syndrome. But those injustices and more that cause outrage in the heart of God go unnoticed and unaddressed. My friends, if we are resistant to the idea of God's wrath and judgment, we might pause to reflect the next time we are outraged about something, about our property values being threatened, or our children's educational opportunities being limited, or our tax benefits being taken away. All of us are capable of anger about something. God's anger, however, is pure. It does not have the maintenance of privilege as its object, but goes out on behalf of those who have no privilege to speak of. The wrath of God is not an emotion that flares up from time to time as though God has overreactions or temper tantrums. The wrath of God and the judgment of God is a way of describing his absolute hatred against all sin and injustice, and his divine will to set things right. Belshazzar faced judgment, in part because of his profaning of the sacred vessels, and that was a direct insult and affront to the people of God. God does not need anyone to defend his cups, but God will defend his people. The medieval Christians had a saying that all life is lived coram Deo, before the face of God. If everyone and everything on earth belongs to God and is therefore sacred, and if all of our life is lived coram Deo, before God's face, can you and I really be certain that we will not face judgment ourselves for profaning the things that are sacred to God? On March 26, 2000, Seattle's famed Kingdome, home of the Seattle Seahawks, Mariners, and the Supersonics, was destroyed. The company Controlled Demolition Inc., or CDI, was hired to do the job of imploding the 25,000-ton structure that had marked Seattle's skyline for 24 years. What was remarkable about the event was the extreme measures taken to ensure that no one was hurt. CDI had experience with over 7,000 demolitions and knew how to protect people. Engineers checked and rechecked the structure. The authorities evacuated several blocks around the Kingdome. Safety measures were in place to allow the countdown to stop at any time if there was concern about safety. All workers were individually accounted for by radio before the explosives were detonated, and a large public address system was used to announce the final countdown. In short, therefore, CDI took every reasonable measure and more to warn people of the impending danger. That is why Daniel 5 should set the alarm or sound the alarm for us today. We have no excuse. God has taken every reasonable measure to warn us of this danger. God has announced his priorities, God has announced what we should learn, and God will announce his judgment. We cannot sit idly by and revel in Belshazzar's downfall, thinking that God's judgment will never come to us. 1 Peter 4:17 states, "It is time for judgment to begin in the household of God." Wherever you are today, seated at home, in your bedroom, in the car, downstairs in the park, listening to this, hear this. The writing is on the wall. We now know that there is a God who is sovereign over all the earth, who is in control and watches over the affairs of humanity. Let us not be tried and found wanting. Let us not take the concept of God's judgment lightly. No matter what happens to us, we must live our lives in the light of God's judgment. Whether the government knows or not is not the issue. God knows. Whether your boss knows or not is not the issue. God knows. Whether your family knows or not is not the issue. God knows. And because God knows everything, we must learn to submit all of our lives to his final judgment. There is a word of good news in this. Recall Daniel. He is an exile. He is only in Babylon because his people have been judged by God and are living now their terrible punishment. Yet Daniel is flourishing. His obedience to God allows him to be in the position to deliver God's judgment on Israel's enemy. Is this not a message of hope? That even those who have once been judged by God can somehow find themselves part of God's redemption through faith in Him. There are people who object to God's judgment and say, wait a minute, how can any sin deserve God's destruction? If God is just, how can He punish like this? Suppose a student punches another student in class. What would happen? A student is given detention. And suppose that during detention, this student punches the teacher. What happens? The student gets suspended from school. Suppose that on the way home from school, the same student punches a policeman on the nose. What happens? He finds himself in jail. And suppose many years later, the same boy is in a crowd waiting to see the president. As the president passes by, the boy lunges forward to punch the president in the face. What happens? He will likely be shot dead before he even approaches the president. In every case that I've just described to you, the crime is precisely the same, punching someone in the face. But the severity of the crime and the punishment for it is measured by the one against whom it is committed. What comes, therefore, from sinning against God? Everlasting destruction. My brothers and sisters, I know that we are going through tough times. And believe me, I would have loved for nothing else, than to have come here this morning to preach yet another message of God's comfort in times of trial. But the truth is that even in these tough times, you and I have no excuse for sinning against God. God doesn't fuss over cups. He fusses over that which separates you and I from Him. And each time we rebel, we take what is sacred to Him and we turn it into sacrilege. The message of hope is that God's solution to our sacrilege is the cross. The cross is God's ultimate warning of the consequences of sin and the greatest expression of His love for sinners. There is a hymn on the crucifixion that goes, "You who think of sin but lightly, nor suppose the evil great, here may view its nature rightly, here its guilt may estimate." To end, I want to share this story by William Willimon, a retired bishop of the United Methodist Church. Early in his ministry, Bishop Willimon served a little church in rural Georgia. One Saturday, he and his wife went to a funeral in a little country church, a church that wasn't a Methodist church. Bishop Willimon had grown up in a big downtown church, so he had never been to a funeral like this one. It was an open casket, and the funeral consisted of a sermon by their preacher. The preacher pounded on the pulpit and looked at the casket. He said, "It's too late for Joe. He might wanted to have get his life together. He might wanted to get his life together. He might have wanted to spend more time with his family. He might have wanted to do all of that, but he's dead now. It's too late for him, but it's not too late for you. There is still time for you. You can still decide. You are still alive. It's not too late for you. Today is the day of decision." Then the preacher went on to tell a story of how a bus had crashed into the funeral procession once on the way to the cemetery. And that could happen to those of them gathered that day. He said, "You must decide today. Today is the day to get your life together. It's too late for old Joe, but it's not too late for you." Later, reflecting on this sermon and the experience, this is what the bishop said. He said, I was so angry at that preacher. On the drive home, I turned to my wife and I said, have you ever seen or heard anything as manipulative and insensitive to that poor family? I found it disgusting. And this is what she said. I have never heard anything like that. It was manipulative. It was disgusting. It was insensitive. And worst of all, it was true. Beloved of God, the judgment of God may seem disgusting. It may seem insensitive, but it is also true. God doesn't fuss over cups. He fusses over you. Mene, tekel, parsin. Those are not words that are the handwriting against Belshazzar. It is the handwriting of God for us. By His own hand, God warns us of the gravity of sin. As you hear this word, I hope that you will commit to living lives of radical obedience and unimpeachable morality through the power of the Spirit. My brothers and sisters, let us hand over our lives completely to God by committing to live a life of obedience to Him, no matter what happens. God will be faithful to the end. Let us who love Him do likewise.